Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Snare Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis and today I'm going to be talking about the idea of being a self-taught musician. This is something that was asked of me recently and I've been asked about it a number of times in the past. And this particular episode is motivated by a recent comment I got in my YouTube comments section. And I thought rather than giving some half-baked reply in the comments section, it would actually make for a really interesting discussion as a podcast topic. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Just in the introduction there, we were hearing an excerpt of one of my ensemble pieces entitled Contemplation. This is another piece from my recent collection called Snare Drum Compositions Volume 2, the Meditations collection. And it's a nice piece that was actually originally inspired by De La Cluse's work. It's since evolved to contain much more rudimental themed passages, but the initial piece, which was actually entitled Zarabanda, was based on De La Cluse's orchestral work. And the piece is perhaps one of the most orchestrally motivated or inspired that I've done to date. That doesn't mean it's an orchestral piece, of course, but it's certainly inspired by that. Now, before we begin, with this being called the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast, it occurred to me that I've actually featured very little from that book. So before we begin, I'm going to play a piece here entitled Etude Number 1, 24 Permutations. And this is from the Snare Drum Virtuoso book. This is one of the etudes at the end of that collection that's kind of included as something of a graduation study, if you like. So it's one of the major pieces of that book. So before we go any further, let's listen to Etude Number 1, 24 Permutations from the Snare Drum Virtuoso. Permutations there from the Snare Drum Virtuoso. Now, as normal, if you enjoy this podcast, you enjoy the topics discussed and you like the content, please feel free to check out my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, where you will find a wealth of information about me, my publications, my work and research, my compositions, and of course access to my YouTube channel, which has a wealth of videos, instructional, pedagogical, performance-based, all to do with the drums, drumming and music generally. So it would be great to see you there. Pop along and say hello. So, onto the topic at hand. What is the nature of being a self-taught musician? Is it possible? Is it viable? Is it feasible? And is it desirable? And in a broader sense, what is the role of teachers generally? There are many people who feel they don't have access to a music teacher, a drumming teacher, many people who perhaps don't have the finances to fund it or don't have decent music teachers in their location, and they look online, they just don't want a one-to-one teacher. They just want to learn in their own way, explore the things they're interested in. But at the same time, there's almost this stigma attached to it. And many people, especially young people and beginners without much experience on the instrument, might feel that they are doing something wrong by learning the instrument in their own way when they, quote unquote, should be doing it properly with a teacher. Now, this opens a whole can of worms as to the nature of properly on an instrument, right? The nature of doing it correctly in an art form. So I have to be very careful about what I say here, because fundamentally, above all things, and I believe this very, very strongly, art, music, and drumming is for everybody, and there should be absolutely no elitism or gatekeeping that stops somebody doing something they enjoy. I believe that wholeheartedly and fundamentally. So anybody that encounters resistance saying you shouldn't be doing this on your own, get a teacher, I think needs to walk away and talk to somebody else, find a new community, because anybody is welcome to explore an art form in their own way, anytime, anywhere, anyhow, and nobody has the right to tell them they are doing it wrongly and that they should stop. I absolutely stand by that till my dying breath, okay? Music and the arts are for everybody. So if some kid somewhere in their bedroom is subscribed to some online platform and they are learning that way rather than working with a teacher, or they are just looking at sporadic YouTube videos and taking what they can from it and trying their best to apply it in their bedroom, brilliant. Keep doing it. Anything that gets somebody engaged and active on the instrument is a good thing. So I want to start this episode on no uncertain ground, in no uncertain terms. Do I think people should at any point be discouraged from exploring an instrument just because they don't have access to a teacher? Now, with that said, that doesn't really answer the question as to whether or not it is possible to achieve a certain level, or, as the question that motivated all this asked, achieve the fundamentals in a meaningful way without a teacher. And this is where things get a little bit murky. Because on the one hand, I think there are things that you can only achieve with a teacher. And on the other hand, I think there are things that you can only achieve autodidactically with study on your own, self-study. And I think there's a broad divide, and I'm going to try and address this divide and talk about why I think both are important, but in different ways and at different stages. Now, before I go any further, I absolutely believe that musicians of any level can benefit from visiting a teacher at any point in their careers, because they give one of the most important things of all, which is perspective. So to give you a very brief example before I go any further, when I conducted my first Arts Council project in around 2019-2020, it was my first foray into the snare drum as a genuine solo instrument. I'd been a drum kit player for over a decade professionally before then, and for 15, 20 years in my entire life before that. So I had an awful lot of drum kit experience, but very little dedicated snare drum experience. So the first thing I did when I began this project was seek out some dedicated snare drummers who were able to give me perspective on something that I previously lacked. I had an awful lot of perspective, an awful lot of expertise and knowledge and experience with the drum kit. But I had very little of those things when it came to the snare drum as a solo instrument, not because I was incapable, not because I was clueless, but because there are little characteristics, idiosyncrasies, fundamentals and concepts and perspectives that you only get from specializing on that certain element. And it was something I had never specialized in before. So when I visited these teachers, they were able to get me thinking about things in a way that I previously hadn't considered. They were getting me to think about and consider ideas or consider technical fundamentals that I just previously hadn't thought about. Either I hadn't encountered them, or I didn't think they were important. I didn't think they were worth considering, or it just never occurred to me. So this is where the real benefit of the teacher comes in. They give you perspective on things that you just wouldn't think of yourself. So if we think of this beginner trying to do it all themselves, maybe they don't have access to a teacher, maybe they don't have the means, maybe they don't have the finances, maybe there's no teacher nearby, maybe they don't have access to Zoom calls and things like this. Who knows? There are many reasons that somebody wouldn't have access to a teacher. What can they do on their own? Well, of course, they are capable of following instructions. They're capable of reading books. They're capable of following YouTube videos and things like this. But what they're incapable of doing is considering the things that a teacher would get them to consider, mostly because, as I've said, they are things that they wouldn't necessarily think about or consider on their own. It's that old speech, isn't it? There are the things we know we don't know, the known unknowns, but then crucially, there are the unknown unknowns. And this is the real vulnerability for the beginner. It's the unknown unknowns that are the damning thing, right? The damning indictment are the things that the beginners simply don't realize that they don't know. And this is where a teacher comes in. Beginners have predispositions. Beginners have biases as to how they think they should be playing the instrument, and they let this steer them towards things that are not always necessarily the most productive or the most beneficial. So the teacher is there to cast their experienced eye on the progress made by the beginner, to point them in the right direction and to get them considering things that they wouldn't otherwise have considered. And I have seen this time and time again in my own studio when I have visiting students who maybe just come for a one-off or just a short span of lessons for a very specific purpose. I'm quite often very able to give them very easily, very quickly, I'm able to see the element they're missing. And when I show them this, it's like the light bulb switches on and they realize what they've been missing the whole time. And that's why they come to a teacher. That's the sole reason they had come to somebody like me, to try to gain that missing piece of the puzzle that they didn't even realize was missing. It might be something really simple, like, I just can't get my head around this double stroke roll thing. I can't seem to get my hands working. I can't produce the second stroke. And I've been doing this, and I've been trying to follow this, and I've been doing this method and practicing this for hours. And it becomes very clear to me, very apparent very quickly, that they haven't considered maybe an element in their grip or a fulcrum or the use of the fingers or who knows what. But it becomes very clear very quickly that they've missed something, and that something that they had missed would never have occurred to them, or may never have occurred to them, no matter how studious they were in their own self-study. So this is the real benefit of teachers, is giving you that perspective. And mostly, and a lot of people forget this, a lot of people with this kind of reverse snobbery, turning their nose up at teachers. Who are they to tell me how to do it? This is an art form. What a lot of people forget, sometimes conveniently so, is that at some point that teacher was a student themselves, and they have encountered these same difficulties. They have been through the same trials and those same frustrations. Goodness knows, in my own path, I've got holes in my studio wall that, rather than patching up, I leave to show to students who become frustrated, because the number of times I've had students sitting at my kit getting frustrated because they can't do something, and they've looked to me and they said something like, "You don't know what it's like," or I bet this never happened to you. And with a smug smile, I stroll over to the wall opposite my drum kit, and I point to the little the drum tip, the tip of a drumstick, that little shaped hole in my wall. And I say to them, "How do you think that hole got there?" And they look at me with wonderment as I describe how not so long ago it was me sitting there, frustrated that I couldn't do the thing that this student was now struggling with, and I'd become so frustrated I'd hurled my drumstick across the room and put a hole in my brand new wall. So I leave it there as a little reminder of this bigger fact, right? That the teacher who is there to help you was at one point in your shoes, on your stool, struggling with the exact same thing you are now struggling with yourself. And that is invaluable. That's what makes the teacher invaluable. And I can vividly remember I was studying with, I've had so many great teachers, but I was studying with a colleague and mentor of mine, Paul Hose, and then Massimo Russo over in Italy, Rob Hirons over in France, Rick Dior and Joe Tompkins over in America, two phenomenal snare drummers there in their own right, saying, "God, I can't do it. Why can't I do this?" And they were able to help me and guide me, and eventually I overcame the difficulties and I was able to do it myself, or I got to the point where I was at least more comfortable with what I could do myself. And that in itself made the things I have to offer to my students so much more valuable, because the number of students I have sitting in here, either at my snare drum or at my kit with a pad or whatever it is they're working on, trying to do something that at one point or another I couldn't do myself. That really makes it valuable. And I think this is the thing that self-learners are in danger of missing out on. There is, of course, an awful lot that a sufficiently dedicated and studious person can do on their own without a teacher. I, for example, have learned to bake on my own. I've got some books and I've watched some YouTube videos and followed some recipes, and through trial and error and practice and experience, I can bake a half-decent white bloomer, right? But if I had Paul Hollywood in the room with me, he would probably spot in a microsecond something I was doing badly, that with a simple fix, with a simple change of perspective or a simple new technique or way of thinking about something would instantly improve, let's say, the quality of my dough. Maybe I'm kneading the dough in a strange way, or I'm simply not doing it for long enough. I think I'm doing it for long enough and I'm not. Or maybe I'm combining the yeast with the salt or the sugar in a way that kills the yeast. Now, how would I know that? How would I know when the ingredients recipe list says combine all the ingredients in a bowl, that if I put the yeast straight onto the salt, that it kills the yeast? How would I know that? Unless somebody who's done it themselves or with actual knowledge of the task tells me that. So I have learnt to bake a half-decent loaf of bread on my own, but I am under no illusion as to what I can't do and what I don't know. I couldn't go and make a professional loaf of bread to sell in a bakery. I can make something that's good for friends or family when they come and visit. But if I wanted to learn to bake at a professional level, the first thing I would do is go and get on a course, and I would go and work with an actual teacher, because there are just things about baking that I just wouldn't know. So in terms of the question, trying not to digress too far down the rabbit hole of baking, to try to return to this idea of learning the fundamentals without a teacher, I think you can to a degree, but not wholly. I think there are elements for which you absolutely need a teacher, most importantly because they have done it themselves. Now, in a previous video, I remember I've got a YouTube video about who should teach technique, which is a little bit of a divisive video, a little bit of a divisive topic, but I addressed the idea of people like myself who go about teaching others how to do something, and specifically how to teach technique. It is a given that the teacher that you trust to teach you how to do something can demonstrably do the thing themselves. I talked about this earlier, right? I can't teach the violin because I can't play the violin. Now, if I'm teaching you how to play a double stroke roll, you should expect from me that I can play a double stroke roll myself, at least sufficiently well enough that you look at it and go, yep, oh, that's good for me. I want to learn how to do that. Because if I can demonstrate the thing to you that you want to know how to do, then you can trust that I can tell you how to do it, right? I can tell you how I got there, the things that worked for me and the things that didn't work for me. Now, in an art form, let's not forget here, the drums and drumming and music is a vast and ancient art form that is deeper than we possibly realize. The philosophies of music, the different concepts, the different ideas of what goes into music, enjoyable, what goes into technique, what goes into skill, the history, the traditions. Oh, it's endless. It's endless. And that's what makes it so fascinating and so fun and pleasurable to explore and to study. But it also makes it so dangerous for the beginner coming into it, because they just sometimes don't know where to turn. And if you take one wrong step, you can find yourself spending years going down a rabbit hole that yields no significant benefits. And again, I know this from experience. I've done it myself. I won't go into the examples now, but I spent years of my life practicing things in a certain way because I thought it was the right thing to do, only to later regret it. And if I had been working with a teacher at the time, they would have perhaps helped me figure that out sooner. So there is a reason that we have syllabi. There is a reason that schools have curricula of music, of progression, of theory, of levels of technique, of studies and repertoire to practice, because it is an attempt by those that can to help those that are learning try to cover all of the important bases. For example, I work with many students who may be interested in jazz drumming, and I'll turn them on to Will Coxon. and they don't know why I'm turning them on to Wilcoxon straight away, but I try to help them see the connection between the phrasing and the techniques and the rhythms and the rudimental repertoire of Wilcoxon, and how that directly informs the early wave of snare drum vocabulary and solo vocabulary in a jazz context. You look at the early jazz drummers, and even some modern jazz drummers today, and you will see the influence, directly or indirectly, of those early rudimental drummers, those early rudimental solos. So that's where the teacher can give you that perspective and give you that breadth of subject knowledge. And before I move on, I want to finish by saying that is perhaps the most noticeable thing when I work with students who have hitherto been completely or almost completely self-taught. Yes, they have often got themselves to the point where they can play to quite a nice level, but what they lack is the breadth. They lack the width of understanding and the depth of knowledge that can only come with structured study and the help of a teacher. So I spend a lot of time with those sorts of drummers, trying to fill in the gaps in their fundamental understanding, fill in the gaps in their subject knowledge, and to explore, to widen, to expand, to broaden their knowledge of the art form, their instrument. I've talked about this in various publications, what I've called subject knowledge. This idea that goes far beyond just your ability to hit a drum. So that's probably the biggest thing I would like listeners to take away from this segment. Yes, being self-taught can yield a lot of results. If you are sufficiently studious and dedicated, you can read books, you can follow instructions online and video lessons and things like this. But what you invariably miss out on is the breadth of knowledge and the depth of understanding and the different perspectives that come from structured learning and an experienced teacher that has been there and done that for themselves. And I'm very fortunate in my stage at the moment that I'm able to share the things I've learned, the things I've studied, the things I've written about and performed and practiced and things like that. I'm able to share that with my students in a way that broadens their knowledge, in a way that my teachers shared with me. Now, I'll come back to this idea in a moment of teachers and how I approached it, because this leads me on to the second statement that I made a little while ago about the double-edged sword, about things you can only do with a teacher, but things you can only do on your own. And it's this latter point that I want to now turn towards and consider, because it's a really interesting one. When I consider my own journey, and I'm going to reference this quite a lot in what's to follow, so I hope you'll bear with me. When I consider my own journey, some of the most important breakthroughs I achieved on my own. I had perhaps started working with a new method book, I'd perhaps started exploring a new genre of music, or I'd found a new favorite drummer or a new favorite band, or who knows what. And this motivated me, this inspired me, and I set about learning and practicing things that no teacher had showed me. And I was able to practice on my own and achieve a certain level such that every time I visited a new teacher, I was able to judge my progress against the things they were teaching me and realize that in my own way, yes, I had made progress. And I think this period of self-study is vitally important for any musician beyond a certain level. I think there becomes a time in every musician's journey where time on their own, focusing on their main influences and their own sources of inspiration, is really important and really productive and really beneficial. Now, this generally happens later on in one's musical career. It's not something I would advise new students and beginners to go and do for the reasons I've already mentioned. But I think beyond a certain point, when you start to have a firmer grasp of the fundamentals, when you start to have a firmer grasp of the real breadth of the art form before you, only you know the reasons why you want to learn that art form and the things you're mainly interested in. Because if, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I had stuck to one weekly teacher, I would have probably progressed well. I would have earned my grades earlier. I would have padded out a lot of gaps in my understanding. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily have sought out or been exposed to the things that I was really interested in, the things that really made me tick, and the things that really made me want to pick up a pair of sticks and play the drums. So to give you an example, in my late teens and early 20s, I was in a thrash metal band, believe it or not. I was in a heavy metal band, and I spent a lot of time on my own working on things like blast beats and double pedal playing, and trying to emulate my favorite drummers from my favorite albums, which were all heavy metal, death metal, black metal, thrash metal, all of that stuff. And that's not necessarily something that a traditional teacher would have done with me, for various reasons, rightly or wrongly. It's not necessarily something you come up against on your Trinity grades, for example. But nevertheless, for me at the time, I was in a small-time touring metal band, and I spent hours and hours inspired by listening to bands like Immortal and trying to copy the blast beats I was hearing there. And yes, I wasn't focusing on things like reading music. I wasn't focusing on my Latin coordination and things like this. But two important things were occurring. Number one, I was getting an awful lot of live experience because I was playing live on stage a lot. In metal clubs and rock bars and all these sorts of things, but I was traveling around the country playing heavy metal live on stage quite regularly. And this taught me a lot about things like hand technique, about endurance, about how to warm up, about how to achieve the things that I wanted to achieve. So even though I did it in a really sort of haphazard manner, it was quite clumsy, it was trial and error, it was brute force, a lot of it, I emerged from the other side of that episode actually armed with quite a lot of experience and first-hand knowledge on how fast playing worked. I was able to play and maintain blast beats and fast rock beats and thrash beats for entire 45-minute set durations. When I first started, I could barely maintain my speed through one song. We always opened the set with one song that was really fast. It began with blast beats, and by 2 minutes into that song, my arm had cramped up and I had to do something different to make it through the end of the song. Whereas by the end of that period, not only could I make it through the entire song, I could make it through the whole set. So obviously something had improved. I'd gained some level of understanding, and the ways in which I practiced, even the dead ends that I went down, yielded useful results and useful understanding, because now, many years later, and a lot more formal tuition under my belt and a lot more formal learning as a student myself, I can look back at those days and I can see the things I did well and the things I did badly. And I can see the dead ends I went down, and I can see the mistakes I made in my thought processes. But nevertheless, that's a valuable learning period. They're all valuable sources of insight that I can now feed back to my students. Likewise, it was through my own study predominantly that I immersed myself in the snare drum. It was in my own studies that I discovered Gary Chaffee's work and worked through his pattern series to the point where I was actually producing YouTube videos on it, because nobody around me, none of the drum teachers around me had any experience with Gary Chaffee. So I thought, well, I'll do it myself. And I was at a point in my playing career where I was able to discern a lot of the Gary Chaffee sticking concepts in a way that was really beneficial to me. And it just added to the experience and knowledge I already had. That all happened on my own. I have never been taught Gary Chaffee's sticking patterns. I did it on my own. And there have also been periods, and this again comes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I have specifically sought out teachers for a specific task. So as I said, when I began my Arts Council project on the snare drum as a solo instrument, the first thing I did was highlight 3 or 4 individuals who I felt were representative of what I was looking for on the snare drum, and I went and had lessons with them. And it wasn't that they were teaching me how to play blast beats, or it wasn't that they were teaching me how to play the drum set, something I'd been doing professionally for over a decade by that point. But they were teaching me things on the snare drum, as I have said, that I wouldn't have considered myself. So there have certainly been times where I have benefited from study on my own, and there are certainly have been times, even to this day, where I will go and seek out a teacher for a specific thing. But I do think it is indicative of many musicians of a certain level, and perhaps artists generally in any art form, where you have to have periods of self-study to really find out for yourself. An example that springs to mind is Dave Weckl, who is, to my mind, one of the finest drummers of all time. I think he is, as I've said before, an example of a master of his instrument. And he embodies exactly what I'm talking about. He attended college. He studied with great teachers, most famously with Freddie Gruber. But he also had periods of intense study and practice completely on his own. I was at one of his clinics many years ago, and he talked about how in the summer holidays when school was out, he would spend 10, 15 hours a day in his college's music department practicing. Now, he'd be the first to admit that he didn't maintain that for long. That was an extremely intense period because he had the facilities and the time available him to do it, so he made the most of it. But nevertheless, it represented periods of intense self-study where I think it's possible to have breakthroughs and sort of gain revelations and realizations about the art form that you can't do with a teacher. No matter how much I would like as a teacher, I can't flick my fingers at will and give my students the revelations they need. Sometimes the things I say, the perspectives I give them, will trigger a little revelation. The light will go on behind their eyes and they'll go, I see, that's made the connection between these things. Whereas sometimes all I can do is kick them in the right direction and tell them to go and work on it. Come back to me when you've spent 50 hours practicing this. As long as I'm confident that they're working on the right things and they know what they've got to do, it's that time at their own practice pad, in their own practice room, where those realizations happen. And that was certainly the case with me. I've had a lot of teachers throughout my career, and all of them have had very valuable insights to share with me. But it was ultimately the time I spent on my own at my own practice pad, sticks in my hand, that I learned the most. So this is why I said right at the beginning that this is such a double-edged sword, because there are certainly things you can only achieve with a teacher, and there are certainly things that you can only achieve on your own. Now, what is the conclusion then to draw from this rambling account of self-study? Well, there are, of course, outliers. We can all name musicians, famous musicians, whether they're pop stars or rock stars or jazz greats or anything else, who have never had a teacher, or at least claim to never have had a teacher. They've done it all themselves. They've figured it out for themselves. Now, I don't believe that is necessarily true. That doesn't mean I think they're lying, but it means I think they found their information in different ways. They found their sources, they found their motivation and inspiration in their own way, and they were able to apply it to themselves in the ways I've described in this autodidactic study. But I think the vast majority of people, even those at the very top, the world-class musicians, have a history of studying with teachers. I don't believe, ultimately, if you put a gun to my head and ask me what I really think, I don't believe you can achieve everything you need to attain a high level of musical ability, whatever that means, entirely on your own. And I think when you look at the great musicians of any discipline, you will find periods of study, be that at famous conservatoires or with famous teachers, or even just with particularly good teachers with whom they were able to form a happy and productive personal connection. Or maybe even in the case of Mozart's case, just happening to be born into one of the most musical families in the country, into a family whose father was already a renowned and professional musician. That has a profound effect on a child, even if they don't necessarily have formal tuition of their own. To be surrounded by that level of musical activity is, in its way, a form of education. So I think ultimately, to answer the question, if I had to give a definitive answer, no, I don't think it is possible to achieve all of the fundamentals required entirely on your own. I just don't see how some of the things, some of the perspectives, some of the concepts can be gained entirely on your own. Now, that doesn't mean, by way of a counterpoint, that doesn't mean that that can only occur from a one-to-one relationship with a face-to-face teacher, or an online teacher. This can occur from maybe a particularly lucid YouTube video or a series of podcasts. Maybe it doesn't necessarily matter where that information comes from, but I do think there is a certain level that you can't achieve for yourself because you have too blinkered a perspective. I think ultimately, even the most determined autodidactic learner will go elsewhere, seek answers from somebody else. So while I stand by my conclusion that I don't think it is possible to attain certain things entirely on your own, that doesn't mean it necessarily has to come from a one-to-one teacher all the time. Now, as I've said previously, for many musicians who are beyond a certain level, the student-teacher relationship becomes more akin to a doctor-patient relationship. This has been my relationship with teachers for the past 10, 15 years. Rather than having weekly lessons where I went to the same teacher every week to learn how to do it, I spent most of my time practicing on whatever I wanted to practice, and when I encountered an obstacle, I went and sought out a particular teacher for a period of time to try to help me overcome that. And that really helped me. That was really valuable to me because I could choose the teacher I wanted and I could approach them to teach me specifically the things I wanted. And they were able to give me those insights and bits of perspective that I had missed myself. For beginners, I absolutely think regular contact with an experienced teacher is by far and away the best way to do it. But I fully appreciate that that's not possible for some people. And there's an awful lot you can do without that, especially if you have access to the internet. We've got this unbridled access to the sum total of humanity's knowledge. For me, the best way I can perhaps answer it is to say, if I were to start a new skill and I really wanted to ensure I was doing it properly, absolutely the first thing I would do is go and seek out a teacher. Whether I was learning to draw, whether I really wanted to learn to bake properly, whether I wanted to, who knows, go and learn the violin after all this time talking about it, the first thing I would do is go and find a teacher. Now, that doesn't mean I would necessarily sign up to one-to-one lessons every week. It might mean, especially in the case of something like the violin, which is a musical instrument, I would probably sign up for maybe 4 or 8 lessons and then say, give me some things to go away and work on. And then I would go and work on it. And then I would go back in a few months' time to go on to the next stage, because I am experienced enough as a musician to understand the core concepts and the key principles, but I would need the dedicated instruction from a violinist to help me on the specifics. Take something like drawing. I'm not an artist in that sense. I can't draw. I've never drawn. I'm not particularly good at, pen and paper art. I would go to a teacher regularly. I would join a class and I would go regularly to try to get that information that I just simply don't have. I don't have the experience. I don't have any knowledge or expertise at all that I can draw upon. So there, I would be completely clueless, and I would say to the teacher, yep, give me some homework each week and I'll see you next week, because that's the best way I can think of to learn. Now, I already referenced my baking journey. I can bake a half-decent loaf of bread, but I by no means consider myself a skillful baker. So I would go and seek out a teacher if that was something I wanted to go and learn properly. But of course, I've got to the point where I can bake a half-decent loaf of bread entirely on my own. And it's this last word, properly, that I want to close with today. I've made reference to it a few times. Learning to do it correctly, learning to do it properly. What does this mean in the context of an art form? Because as I alluded to right at the beginning, who am I to tell somebody else they're doing it incorrectly? If that's how they want to do it, if that's how they choose to do it. So what do we mean, really, by this idea of doing it properly or learning to do it properly? Let's go to a teacher to learn how to do it properly. What does that mean? All of the students that come to me trust that I am teaching them how to do it, quote unquote, properly. They are trusting that all the books on my shelves, the certificates on my wall, and the lessons that I teach them ultimately mean that they are going to leave my studio better able to play the drums than when they entered it. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Now, they have an idea in mind of what they want to achieve. They have an idea in mind, a vision of what their successful drumming would look like or sound like. And they trust that by coming to me regularly, spending all this money on having lessons with me, they trust that I am able to help them do that. And that's why doing things like the graded examinations can be an important path, an important part of that path, because it validates the progress they are making. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole today of the role of assessment in the arts. I've talked about that at great length in the book I co-authored, The Creative Practitioner with Paul Hose. I'll come on to that another day. But the role of assessments, one of the roles of assessment in the arts is to hold the teacher to account, to hold the organization, the institution to account. Because ultimately, a new student who comes here either for themselves or for their son or daughter and pays me all this money every week to teach them or their children how to play the drums, they have no way of knowing if I'm teaching them anything of value. Whereas if after 6 months or a year they get their grade 1, and then a few months or a year after that they get their grade 2, these accredited international qualifications, they get some peace of mind that they or their children are actually improving in a meaningful way, and having it written down on paper is like a nice piece of validation that they've been learning something properly. But I've always been fascinated by this idea of properly, because who am I to say what proper double stroke roll technique is? Who am I to say what the proper way of composing a snare drum solo is? Or who am I to say what the proper way of learning and practicing and performing a bossa nova is on the drum kit? Well, the only way I know how to answer that is by demonstrating the way I do it and leaving it to everybody else to decide whether that's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. We get into sort of normative ethics territory here. It's not like there's some universal rule of the universe that says this is how a double stroke roll is done. I do a double stroke roll and other people say, yep, I like that. Yep, that sounds good. Yes, I want to learn that. Or no, that's no good. That doesn't sound good. That doesn't sit well with me. So every student that comes to me at some point makes that judgment that what I have demonstrated is a thumbs up, right? They say, yep, that sounds good to me. Teach me how to do that. And I try to be very clear. If somebody asks me for something that I don't feel experienced or qualified to teach them, I will tell them, because I would rather do that than teach them something by basically pulling it out of thin air, by making it up. So the only things I will teach people are things that I can demonstrate myself. And I think that's a really important point. And ultimately, I think that's the sole defining feature of what it means to do something properly. Well, does it function the way we want it to function? Now, I've referenced Mozart just recently. In Mozart's early career, he was criticized for the way he composed. He was criticized famously in the film Amadeus for having too many notes. Well, now, these days, Mozart is celebrated as one of, if not the greatest composers of all time. Maybe that's because he didn't do it properly or he did it unconventionally, but he did it in a way that produced spectacular results, spectacular effects. And I've talked about this before, I think. A number of years ago, I was visiting Australia because my wife is Australian. And on one of our visits, I went down to Brisbane and studied with a drum teacher called Grant Collins. And he is an incredible drummer, incredible drum kit player. If you've not seen him, look him up on YouTube. He has some incredible coordination, multi-pedal orchestration and all sorts. But when I studied with him, he was playing something really fast on the ride cymbal And he was holding the drumsticks in a really unconventional way between his first and second knuckles. I can't demonstrate it, of course, on a podcast, but in a really unconventional way that you would never see in a textbook or a drum lesson. And he found it hilarious, that my furrowed brow spotting his unconventional technique, and he could see the thoughts in my mind of, that's not how you hold a drumstick. That's not the right way to hold a drumstick. And yet here was this incredibly accomplished professional musician playing on the ride cymbal faster than I could ever dream of at the time. So what does that tell us about the nature of doing it properly? Well, ultimately, we have to judge these things based on what works. We have to judge these things based on whether they achieve the desired result. So I can't make any universal grand claim that what I teach is proper or correct or the right way of doing the drums. What I can teach is simply, bluntly, what works for me, what worked for me. And the judge of that is when people look at what I've done, what I've played, what I've written, or whatever, whether or not they like it and whether or not they want to learn to play like that. Because if somebody came to me and wanted to learn from me, but they said, I don't like your drumming, I don't like your compositions, I don't like the albums you've played on, and I don't think you're very good, but can I have a drum lesson, please? I would say, why on earth would you waste your money on me? If you don't like anything I've done, you don't like anything I've played, and you don't like the way I play it, please go somewhere else. Because the only thing I can teach is what I know how to do myself. And this idea of the functional being the sole arbiter of what is good, what is proper, what is correct, takes us back full circle to the sole reason we have a teacher in the first place, which is that they have experience doing something that we want to know how to do ourselves. And that's it. So when I selected my teachers, when I went to study with certain teachers, I didn't just go to the best of all time. I didn't just try and seek out the Dave Weckels and the Thomas Langs and the Virgil Donatis of this world just because they were nominally the best at on some list on the internet. I looked at the drummers who were specifically playing in the sort of way that I wanted to play, or teaching the certain things that I wanted to learn, or doing it in the sort of ways that I was looking to do it. And I went and sought those people out. So I went and sought out Rick Dior because I had seen him play the snare drum, and I thought, I want to learn how to do it like that. And that's the crucial qualifier. It's not that I thought Rick Dior was doing it better than anybody else necessarily, or that he was doing it more correctly or more properly than anybody else. His was the correct way and everybody else's was incorrect. In fact, some of the things Rick Dior talked about directly contradicted some of the things Dave Weckl talked about. Now, that doesn't mean one is right or wrong. That doesn't mean Dave Weckl was incorrect and Rick Dior was correct, or vice versa. But Rick Dior is only capable of teaching me what he knows and what he does himself. Likewise, Dave Weckl is only capable of teaching anybody what he knows and what he does himself. Now, crucially, both of them are able to demonstrate that the way they do it produces results. So I can look at Dave Weckl play and I go, yep, I would want to play like that. And I can look at Rick Dior and say, yep, I want to play like that. And that's the qualifier that makes me go and seek them out. And that's why I would go to them as a teacher. Rick Dior's not correct. Dave Weckle's not correct. Both of them are correct because both of them can demonstrate it working in the way that I want to learn. So I have been fortunate enough to study with both of them. And then I had to sort of sort out for myself how I deal with the contradiction in what they taught me. Well, both work. So it's up to me to decide what's the most comfortable for me. So ultimately, that's really what it comes down to. That's why we choose a teacher. It's because they are doing it in a way that we want to be able to do it. And that in itself is why it's so valuable and something that it's so dangerous for a beginner to miss. So I won't repeat my conclusion here. I've made it very clear what I think, but I hope this has given you all a few things to think about. It's a really difficult topic. And as I said right at the beginning, rule number one is anybody engaging with an art form should be encouraged in whatever way they are doing it already. There is absolutely no room for gatekeeping and elitism, especially when it comes down to you should be doing it properly, or you should be doing it like this, or don't do it at all. Anybody should be encouraged all the time in all ways to engage with an art form. But there are absolutely things that you can only get from a teacher that you can't find on your own. So I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback about that. You're always welcome to visit me at my website, send me a message, send me an email, tell me why I might be wrong in everything I've just said. It's a fascinating debate, but, well, at the risk of repeating myself, based on where I am now in my own career, the hundreds of students I've worked with and the dozens of teachers I've worked with myself as a student, there is no way I could honestly sit here and say I could have achieved the level I am at now entirely on my own without a teacher. I couldn't say that because there are so many things that I've been taught that I just wouldn't have thought about myself. So I'll leave that with you. And as I say, I invite any feedback or discussion, come and visit me at my website and say hello. So to finish us off, I'm going to play another piece here from my Contemporary Marches collection. This is a really interesting piece where the clue is in the name. This is a piece called Requisite Precision, and it was one of the pieces in that collection that was written with the snare drum part and the bass drum part simultaneously, with the idea of a lot of synchronicity between those two parts. You'll hear what I mean when I play it in a moment, but I hope this has been of interest to some of you. I hope this has given you all a few things to think about. Thank you very much for listening if you've made it this far, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the next episode of the Snare Drum Virtuoso. And to finish off, here is Requisite Precision from Contemporary Marches for Snare Drum. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.